Between Egypt and Israel lies 10,000 square miles of some of the most treacherous terrain on the planet. Called the Sinai Peninsula, its searing heat and unfertile soil make it as inhospitable to habitation today as it was in biblical times. Yet for 40 years, a tribe of former slaves to the Pharaoh struggled against these hostile conditions in its quest to reach the Holy Land, a land promised the Israelites by their God. To assure the journey would succeed, however, their God demanded one condition be met. Would they live by his 10 commandments?
The great mystery of the 10 Commandments is how this seemingly simple set of moral rules became so central to all of Western civilization.
Why have the 10 Commandments survived with such impact to the present? Do the laws against killing, theft, adultery carry the same meaning for us as they did for our ancestors? Why did Moses order the slaying of 3,000 fellow Hebrews at Sinai? And is it possible, as some believe, that tablets preserved in the sacred Ark of the Covenant actually exist? These are but a few of the mysteries of the Bible.
Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great." Genesis 12:1.
So God spoke to Abraham, thereby ordaining him patriarch of the Hebrew people. According to scholars who have traced the genealogy and ages of all biblical figures, this historic moment would have taken place 2,000 years before the birth of Jesus. Yet 2,000 years later, no nation had been formed by the tribe of Abraham. His descendants were now held in bondage in Egypt, a fact well documented in government records of the period. Had their God forsaken the Hebrews? Or, as the faithful believed, was he awaiting another unique mortal who could carry out his will? As a young man, Moses struck dead an Egyptian guard for beating a Hebrew slave and had to flee for his life. Years passed as he tended sheep in the land of Midian, hundreds of miles east of Egypt. Then one day, he happened upon a bush that was afire, but strangely not consumed by it. It was at this moment, according to the scriptures, that God selected the successor to Abraham.
Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Exodus 3:7.
With God's counsel and aid, 10 crippling plagues are brought upon the Egyptians. Moses then is able to lead an unarmed people away from a mighty military force, bringing them to safety. With the wondrous parting and closing of the Red Sea, their total freedom is assured. The Bible records their number at 600,000. And while not all were Hebrews, all now willingly fall under the leadership of Moses. Having reached the mountains in the desolate Sinai where God first spoke to him, Moses is told what is expected of him now.
Now, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Exodus 19:5.
If Abraham was the patriarch, Moses has become the one to unite the people and bring them soon to the promised land. But how are we to regard this leading figure in the Bible? Was there a man of flesh and blood who presided over the astonishing Exodus and imminent drama at Sinai?
I believe in a Moses who lived and did much of what the Bible says about Moses, but I don't believe the Bible is intended to be a textbook of history. Moses saw God face to face. And that means that of all the heroes in the Bible, there is something unique, unrepeatable, special about Moses.
With a mixture of awe and dread, Moses and the Israelites await the words of God that will shape their destiny.
Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke, because the Lord had descended upon it in fire, while the whole mountain shook violently. Moses would speak, and God would answer him in thunder. Exodus 19:18.
In a setting rich with mystery and ambiguity, the 10 Commandments are first delivered by God. Contrary to popular notion, Moses had not ascended Sinai. Along with the Israelites, he had received God's word at the base of the mountain.
You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, bow down or worship them. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Honor thy father and mother. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house or anything belonging to your neighbor. Exodus 20:2.
These were and are the 10 Commandments.
When God came to little Israel, so recently enslaved, having nothing, they said, yes, we will take this law code. Yes, we will take this Torah, and that will be the heart of who we are.
In the 3,500 years since Moses led his people to Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments, no tangible evidence has been uncovered indicating upon which mountain rising from this blistering hot desert the historical biblical drama unfolded. Yet 300 years after the time of Jesus, Emperor Constantine was convinced that this forbidding site, known to nomads as Jebel Musa, the Mountain of Moses, was the holy place, and ordered a monastery built here to commemorate the event. It is known as St. Catherine's. On the summit above it stands a small church where some believe the commandments were given to Moses. However, archaeologists have failed to find any evidence that an ancient people ever stopped here, or, as the Bible also indicates, spent 40 years wandering about this barren wilderness itself. Despite the absence of proof, Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike do not question the authenticity of the tale told in the Scriptures.
If something didn't happen on Sinai to the children of Israel, they would have had to make up a story that it had. This is such a turning point in the people's life, to go from being slaves to being the recipients of redemption and the law. This is a primary moment in Israel's self-understanding.
The people may have heard God proclaiming the 10 Commandments at the base of Mount Sinai, but the thunder and lightning obscured their full meaning. God then orders Moses to the mountaintop to receive the law again, in writing. The Israelites were very familiar with the Code of Hammurabi, the sophisticated set of laws by which the pharaohs ruled, as well as the legal systems of other Near East societies. Much of human behavior considered base in the commandments, murder, stealing, adultery, was also forbidden in those cultures. But the resemblance ended there. For the first 3 commandments were emphatic in declaring how the Hebrew God was different from all other gods known in the Near East. There could be no sun god, no rain god, no god of war. Only one invisible God, who humans must never attempt to represent in the form of idols or speak of irreverently.
Part of what's going on in the 10 Commandments is they're making the point, we are not the Egyptians. Part of what it's saying is you won't be like those people who enslaved you and who were so committed to their monumental architecture, they didn't care how many of your people died making the monumental architecture.
While Christians and Muslims later adopted the full spirit of the 10 Commandments, The second commandment, which prohibits making a likeness of God, wasn't taken literally by Christians. Masterpieces of church art boldly present God in Bible stories. Had a major commandment been broken, how is this interpretation of a sacred law explained?
There's a different dynamic at work in the Christian community from the beginning because of the whole doctrine of the incarnation. If God has become flesh in the person of Jesus, then the human body becomes an image of God, which after all is the biblical tradition. We are created in God's image. But as soon as, Jesus called God Father in his own prayer. If God is addressed as Father, then one could begin to portray God in paternal human imagery.
For those of the Jewish faith, however, no likeness of God was or is permitted. And while Moses would spend many days on Mount Sinai with God, the Bible offers no physical description of him. Nor during this period of divine instruction is there indication Moses saw him. He was at most a voice, a presence.
When God finished speaking with Moses at Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the covenant, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. Exodus 31:18.
Then suddenly God is angered and orders Moses off the mountain. God has just seen that the Israelites below have built a false idol, a golden calf, and are worshiping it. He threatens to destroy the entire community and have Moses begin a new nation alone. Thus begins an extraordinary sequence of events which continues to provoke theologians and scholars. First, Moses pleads with God to revoke his catastrophic plan. And surprisingly, God accedes to Moses' wish. When Moses arrives on the scene and witnesses the flagrant idolatry himself, he also becomes incensed. In his rage, he smashes the holy tablets.
He sees broken commandments, as it were. And what does he do? He breaks the tablets on which the commandments are written. And so it is as if a certain brokenness evokes another brokenness. As if the chaos evokes the anger.
What possessed Moses' people to defy the Lord? How could they worship a golden calf after all they had come to know of God?
The golden calf was not a substitute for God. It was a substitute for Moses. Because as long as Moses was there as the visible symbol of the God of Israel, they were fine. The great sin was that God was trying to teach the Israelites that the greatest reality is that which you cannot see. And they hadn't learned that lesson yet.
But for the sin of idolatry, Moses orders the righteous to take the sword to every brother, friend, or neighbor who defied the second commandment.
The sons of Levi did as Moses commanded, and about 3,000 people fell on that day. Exodus 32:28.
The fourth commandment, thou shalt not kill, already given to Moses twice, seems to have been totally disregarded. How could this terrible act be reconciled with the law?
For that beginning community, bad religion was seen as contagious. Think of it as a bad infection. When the Levites kill those persons, their task is to cut out the infected portion, and in doing so, get back to the true religion.
The correct translation of the commandment is not "thou shalt not kill," but "thou shalt not murder." The Bible clearly believes that in certain circumstances, killing is justified.
But the violence at Sinai is an exceptional episode in the Hebrew Testament. Never again would brother kill brother on this scale. Moses makes a second journey to the mount to find that God has forgiven the Israelites for their transgression. He gives Moses a new set of tablets and bids him to lead his people on. His face aglow, Moses returns for the final time from his theophany, the term which describes a mortal's encounter with the divinity. The tablets are to be kept in a special ark beneath the tabernacle. Both will be borne by the Israelites on the danger-filled journey ahead. Of all the mysteries of the Bible, perhaps none is more intriguing than why the laws governing a new nation would be handed down in the midst of the menacing Sinai, a remote region that seems inimical to life itself, rather than a settled community's temple or court.
I believe the law was given in the wilderness because the wilderness is where we live. You don't need a law in paradise. You need a law to help us navigate through the wilderness. Nobody knows where Sinai is. Perhaps that was intentional because we're not supposed to worship a mountain. We're supposed to worship what happened there. We don't know the place, but we have the message.
While each commandment carried a religious or moral message, many were also considered revolutionary for the ancient time, perhaps none more so than the fourth.
Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, or the alien resident in your towns. Exodus 28.
Prior to the encounter of Moses with God at Sinai, a weekly day of rest was unheard of in any Near East culture. Now, a holy law decreed that everyone, including slaves, was to respect the commandment. The Ten Commandments also recognized the tradition that permitted Hebrews to own slaves themselves.
When we talk about Hebrews as slaves to Hebrews, more typically, we're talking about debt slavery. If you fall into debt, a way to take care of your debt is debt slavery. So first we have to remember this is not the kidnapping of persons from one continent to be slaves in a different continent.
In Mesopotamia, you hurt or injured a slave, you would pay damages to their master. In Israel, if you harm a slave, the slave goes free. The Ten Commandments are special because these are the laws given to the first slaves in history who ever had a successful slave rebellion. This is the vision of a liberated community. This is hope we're being shown here in the form of laws.
Another humane commandment, the fifth, also has resonated through time with universal impact. According to many theologians, it can be the most demanding of the 10.
In the Talmud, one of the rabbis asks his students if he knows which is the hardest commandment. And when they say we don't know, he says the hardest commandment is this: honor your father and mother. It means you must give them a sense that they are the reason why you exist in the world, and you have to give them everything that you can without violating your own sense of priorities and integrity. And that is a very difficult balance that we're still looking for in all of our lives.
We know that in some tribal settings, they simply abandon their old people as they move on. Not so in Israel. This doesn't just mean be nice to them. It means take care of them when they're old. You don't have the right to abandon them.
Most of the 10 Commandments given Moses are bluntly stated. Honor your father and mother. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. With few words, they clearly express behavior required for the survival of any ethical society, then or today. But there appears to be a striking omission in the presentation of these laws. There is no mention of punishment for their violation. Has the Hebrew God left this an open issue? If the vast, foreboding landscape of the Sinai has yet to yield clues, much less proof, to support the book of Exodus' account of the 10 Commandments, Israel itself has been much kinder to scholars and archaeologists who seek to verify the story. The story on which both a religion and a nation base their identity. Nearly a century ago, an ancient document found its way into the hands of a biblical expert. This became known as the Nash Papyrus. It eventually was authenticated as dating to the 2nd century before Jesus. In it, indications are given that the 10 Commandments were recited in the Second Temple as part of daily prayer. The papyrus thus became the first tangible evidence to corroborate the Scripture's story of Sinai. While it doesn't prove the ritual had been practiced for 1,000 years prior to the 2nd century, when the commandments were first given, it does suggest that the legacy of Moses had uncommon staying power and impact. Specific information regarding the 40 years the Israelites spent in the Sinai so far has eluded investigators. However, substantial knowledge of both urban and nomadic cultures of 3,500 years ago has aided insight into the meaning of and the reasons for the 10 Commandments themselves. The law against adultery was not based on moral principle alone, as it is today.
Adultery is the coupling with another man's wife. It is directed towards the man as the primary personality whom the law addresses. It does not cover a girl who has not been betrothed or married. That would be fornication. But adultery needs to be understood in the context of property law. Another man's wife is legally his property, and you may not take it against his will.
Bearing false witness against one's neighbor. Why was this considered among the 10 most serious offenses?
I understand bearing false witness as bringing a charge against another that is untrue. Human relations were not secured if a person's word was not his bond. There's this whole understanding of the word in the Israelite tradition. You know, when a person spoke his word in a sense embodied his personality, and it couldn't be recalled.
You shall not covet your neighbor's house or anything belonging to your neighbor. Exodus 20:17.
The 10th commandment is considered by many the most provocative of all that were received by Moses and the Israelites. No other dealt with what one thought, what was most likely in one's subconscious.
There was the assumption that if you coveted in your head, what happened in your head would move to your hands. And so coveting, while we might think of it as an obscure law that really we can't deal with because it's in our heads, is one of the most important of the 10 commandments. Because once you start wanting what somebody else has, and that somebody else is someone who's in your group, then you quit being a group.
Adultery, bearing false witness, coveting what your neighbor has, all sins in the eyes of a God whose commands have been given for posterity. But no punishments are proscribed if his directives are ignored. How can they be laws if there are no consequences for those who break them? Certainly, other books of the Hebrew Bible list hundreds of punishments for hundreds of crimes. Sacrilegious or antisocial behavior, from improper rituals to incest, is condemned, calling forth punishments ranging from fines to stoning to death. Yet in this covenant God made with the Israelites regarding a fundamental code of behavior, there is no mention of retribution for those who fail to obey. Biblical scholars differ in their understanding of this puzzling question.
It is not a list of laws that some civil or religious authority is meant to go out and enforce. When one violates God's will, as expressed in the commands, it is a violation of the relationship. Just as when we hurt someone whom we love, our response of disappointment in ourselves and pain at the hurt we have caused, guilt and shame are appropriate responses.
These are laws before Freud. The ancient Israelites did not keep these laws for fear of guilt. They kept these laws for fear of loss of identity. If you broke the law, you didn't feel guilty, they put you outside the group. Are you part of the chosen people, or are you outside?
Among the countless mysteries of the Bible, one that continues to perplex scholars is why Moses chooses to repeat the commandments aloud just as he brings his people within sight of the promised land.
Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you from there with a mighty hand. Deuteronomy 5:15.
This thought, now expressed by Moses when he quotes the 4th commandment, does not appear in the text of the book of Exodus. Is the integrity of the commandment somehow affected by this and other similar discrepancies?
There is a school of thought that says that Moses was repeating God's words in Deuteronomy from memory. So even though he made some minor modifications, he was giving the gist of what he understood God to be saying, which perhaps is a good lesson, that even though the Word of God is sacred, each human being will bring to it his or her own interpretation.
The vast Sinai Peninsula appears as uninviting today as it surely was to the masses who followed Moses across it those thousands of years ago. Finally, after a long, tortuous journey, he brought them to within sight of the Promised Land.
The Lord said to him, "This is the land I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." Deuteronomy 34:4.
Moses then dies. During his long life, he led his people out of bondage in Egypt and delivered them to the Holy Land. Yet he had also murdered and disobeyed God in other ways. Why was such an imperfect man chosen by God to create a new nation?
There is no flawless hero in the Hebrew Bible. But by giving us a full picture of Moses, even when Moses stumbles, it enables us both to understand what it is to be a hero and perhaps to push ourselves a little further, to aspire a little higher because we have this image of Moses.
We also have the remarkable legacy of Moses in the form of the first 5 books of the Bible. While most scholars are convinced the books themselves were first written down centuries later by temple priests, they also believe key events, such as the issuing of the 10 Commandments, could be based on historical truth. And what of the tablets Moses brought down from the mount? Did they actually exist? Was an ark built for them? Was it carried by the Israelites through the desert wilderness for 40 years? According to later books of the Bible, yes.
King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were with him before the ark. Then the priest brought the Ark of the Covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, in the most holy place. 1 Kings 8:5.
Archaeological evidence exists that King Solomon, 1,000 years before Jesus, built a great temple in Jerusalem. This commentary in the scriptures, although most likely written much later, lends credence to there once being such a sacred vessel. Writing laws in stone was also a known practice of the period, suggesting tablets with 10 commands could be kept inside. But long ago, the ark mysteriously disappeared, or perhaps it was destroyed along with the first temple by the Babylonians in 586 before the Common Era. As testament both to the power of the idea of the 10 Commandments and the human imagination, The quest has never ended to find the sacred Ark of the Covenant. If it were found, however, would it alter the meaning of the Ten Commandments themselves? More to the point, perhaps, is how these 10 laws, first set down thousands of years ago, continue to influence our lives.
For me personally, the 10 Commandments are 10 expressions of principles that organize my life. When I break these principles, part of my person dies. At this time in the late 20th century, in North America, we're asking, how can we be a people? Part of our civility means returning to the principles of the Ten Commandments.
When I was a young child, I memorized the Ten Commandments. I even had a bracelet with them written on it. I came to understand that Jesus' teaching about the two greatest commandments, the command to love God and to love one's neighbor, are a summary of the Ten Commandments.
For me, the Ten Commandments are the bedrock of our moral tradition, but it's the foundation stone of an ethical vision and of a moral life. The Ten Commandments are irreplaceable.
To me, the Ten Commandments are both a constraint and a liberation. They're things that I can't do, but I understand that you can't paint a picture unless you have a frame. And the Ten Commandments are the frame. They are the limits within which I seek to create out of my life a work of art.
It may seem nothing short of miraculous that 10 laws, first proposed in a spiritual setting millennia ago, came to define religious and social behavior for the entire Western world. Perhaps the most intriguing question to be asked of the Bible's most influential tale: what would our world be like today if Moses had not received those 10 Commandments?